Good morning. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 7:42 Newfoundland Daylight Time, recording number 001. This recording is being archived simultaneously to the station servers, the Canadian Climate Archive in Ottawa, the World Meteorological Organization Data Network, and any remaining university mirrors currently synchronized with our automated transmission schedule. If you're listening to this years from now, and there is no reason to think anyone ever will, then what follows is simply the beginning of an unusually persistent weather event. At least that is what I am required to call it today. Outside my office window, the rain has now been falling continuously for 73 days, 11 hours, and 19 minutes. Not heavy all the time. That's important. People hear the word continuous and imagine biblical downpours. It isn't like that. Sometimes it's only a fine mist, barely enough to disturb the puddles that have long since merged into ponds. Sometimes it thickens into dense gray curtains that erase the Atlantic entirely. There are moments when I almost convince myself it has stopped, only to walk outside and feel the tiny impacts accumulating on my glasses, my notebook, the shoulders of my raincoat. The instruments, of course, never lie. Somewhere above every square meter of this province, water is always descending. Our precipitation total since the event began now exceeds 8,000 millimeters, a value that would normally require several years in this region. Soil moisture sensors have reached saturation at every monitored depth. Rivers remain above flood stage, despite the absence of major storms. Reservoirs are spilling continuously. Hydroelectric production remains unusually strong, though several generating stations have reported increased debris loads from landslides upstream. Surface air temperatures continue to fluctuate within expected seasonal ranges, yet something about the atmosphere refuses to behave according to any model available to us. Upper air soundings show no stable mechanism capable of sustaining cloud formation across an entire hemisphere for this duration. Satellite imagery indicates an immense interconnected cloud field stretching across the North Atlantic, yet no conventional circulation explains its persistence. Every morning I rerun the numerical models using fresh observations, hoping one of them will finally produce a forecast with sunlight somewhere beyond 48 hours. None do. They simply extend the rain. The media still refers to this as the long spring. They enjoy giving weather events names. It reassures people that someone understands them. Government officials continue to emphasize resilience. Farmers are advised to delay planting where possible. Insurance companies have begun quietly revising flood exclusions. Airlines have reduced schedules but remain operational. Ferries continue to sail whenever visibility permits. Schools remain open, although attendance has fallen in some coastal communities because several roads no longer exist. There is as yet no panic. Humans possess a remarkable ability to normalize almost anything if it changes slowly enough. We have lived through wet summers before, floods before, hurricanes before. A few months of relentless rain simply becomes another inconvenience to complain about over coffee. From this station, however, the data tells a less comforting story. Atmospheric humidity remains effectively maxed across an area far too large to sustain itself. The evaporation budget no longer balances with measured ocean temperatures. Freshwater runoff into the Labrador Current has measurably altered coastal salinity in less than 3 months. That's unusually fast. Not impossible, just unusually fast. The equations still work individually, but together they are beginning to resemble witnesses giving contradictory testimony. I've spent 32 years studying weather, 32 years believing that every anomaly eventually yields to better observations and improved mathematics. The atmosphere is chaotic, yes, but never malicious. It follows rules whether we understand them or not. My job has never been to fear unusual data. My job has been to collect it, verify it, and resist the temptation to invent explanations before the evidence exists. That discipline separates climatology from folklore. I intend to keep that discipline for as long as these recordings continue. The station itself remains fully operational. The diesel generators have not been required thanks to the hydroelectric grid. Wind sensors were recalibrated yesterday after salt accumulation exceeded maintenance tolerances. The rain gauges have already required 3 cleanings this month, not because of debris, but because certain species of algae appear to be thriving inside permanently wet collection funnels. I've submitted samples to Memorial University. They are probably nothing remarkable. Moisture encourages life just as easily as it destroys it. I walked down to the shoreline after breakfast. The Atlantic was almost invisible, concealed behind a pale curtain of falling water that merged sea and sky into a single colorless horizon. Somewhere beyond that gray wall are cargo ships, research vessels, fishing fleets, offshore platforms, entire nations beginning their own rainy mornings. I found myself wondering whether every climate scientist across the world had stood at their own windows today, quietly expecting to see the first break in the clouds. We probably all did. We probably all looked upward for a little longer than necessary. There wasn't one. End of recording 001. Tomorrow's forecast remains unchanged. Rain. Good evening. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 21:16 Newfoundland Daylight Time. Recording number 002. Continuous precipitation event duration. 1 year, 151 days. Measured interruptions in precipitation at this station. 0. Rainfall accumulation since onset now exceeds 31,000 millimeters. Average daily precipitation has declined slightly over the past 4 months, though that statement requires explanation. The atmosphere has not become drier. Quite the opposite. The rain simply falls more gently now, almost continuously as a fine suspension rather than distinct showers. It is as though the sky has settled into a permanent state of remembering how to rain instead of deciding when to begin. The first thing I should report is that the seasons have become surprisingly difficult to identify, not impossible, merely muted. Spring never truly arrived this year. Summer existed only as a modest increase in air temperature hidden behind identical cloud cover. Daylight still lengthens and shortens according to celestial mechanics, but visually the world has become nearly constant. Every morning resembles every afternoon. Every afternoon resembles twilight. I occasionally catch myself checking the clock simply to verify that noon has actually occurred. Human beings, I've discovered, do not merely observe sunlight. We use it to organize our thoughts. Without distinct shadows, the hours lose some of their personality. The scientific community remains operational, although noticeably smaller. Several observing stations throughout Northern Europe have gone offline, not because the weather destroyed them directly, but because the roads supplying them have failed. Iceland has evacuated 3 coastal weather installations due to landslide risks. Western Scotland has begun relocating entire villages farther inland. Parts of eastern Canada no longer bother reporting flood emergencies unless lives are immediately at risk. The emergency itself has become the baseline. Statistical language has quietly adapted. Reports now describe rainfall relative to the previous month instead of historical averages because historical averages have ceased to provide useful context. I suppose every civilization eventually rewrites its definitions without realizing it. Global atmospheric circulation models continue to perform poorly beyond approximately 36 hours. That has become one of the more fascinating aspects of this phenomenon. Ordinarily, poor forecasts imply missing observations or chaotic sensitivity to initial conditions. Here, however, every model independently converges toward the same impossible conclusion: the atmosphere should begin drying. Every simulation predicts the gradual erosion of the cloud field. Every simulation restores recognizable weather patterns within 2 weeks, and every morning the satellites reveal exactly what they revealed the day before: a seamless hemisphere of layered cloud stretching from eastern Siberia to the western Atlantic, rotating only enough to preserve itself. The mathematics insists the rain cannot continue. The rain continues anyway. We've begun exchanging less data and more conversations during our international conference calls. That isn't how scientists are trained. We prefer numbers to anecdotes. Yet somewhere around month 8, the conversations changed. Instead of asking whether anyone had identified the forcing mechanism, people began asking one another strange little questions. Have you seen a sunset recently? Does anyone remember the last thunderstorm? Are birds behaving differently where you are? Has anyone noticed how quiet airports sound beneath constant rain? None of these observations are publishable, yet collectively they form a picture that instrumentation struggles to capture. Civilization has developed an entirely new acoustic environment, Rain absorbs distance, it softens engines, conversations, church bells, highways, harbors, even silence sounds wetter now. I've noticed changes within myself that I hesitate to include in an official archive, though perhaps future climatologists, assuming there are future climatologists, may find them relevant. I no longer remove my rain jacket when entering the station. I simply unzip it. There seems little point. The fabric never fully dries before I need it again. I own 6 pairs of waterproof boots, all of which permanently smell faintly of damp leather, despite regular maintenance. Books left near exterior walls develop slight waves along their pages. Coffee cools faster because the air itself seems unwilling to surrender moisture. Every object in this building has acquired a subtle softness, as though the distinction between indoor and outdoor environments is gradually dissolving. The gulls have almost disappeared. At first I assumed they had simply moved inland in search of food, but the migration surveys suggest something more complicated. Many seabirds now spend far longer resting than flying. Continuous rainfall appears to interfere with feather maintenance in ways that ornithologists are only beginning to understand. Fungal infections among coastal bird populations have increased dramatically. Moss is growing on abandoned fishing stages that were painted only last autumn. Entire spruce forests now carry permanent veils of pale lichen that should have taken decades to establish. Nature is not dying. It is renegotiating the terms under which life is allowed to exist. Yesterday I climbed the observation tower just before what should have been sunset. Habit, I suppose. The clouds were unusually bright to the west, and for perhaps 15 seconds I convinced myself they were thinning. I stood there in the drizzle with binoculars, watching the horizon as though patience alone might persuade the atmosphere to reveal the sun. Instead, the brightness slowly diffused until the entire sky became uniformly gray once more. It occurred to me then that there may come a generation of children who possess perfectly functioning eyesight yet have never seen a shadow cast by direct sunlight. They will learn about blue skies the same way my generation learned about passenger pigeons, through photographs whose colors seem almost exaggerated. For the record, I do not believe this event is supernatural. I do not believe the atmosphere has intentions. The laws of physics have not failed. Somewhere there exists an explanation consistent with thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and radiative transfer. I remain absolutely convinced of that. But conviction is not evidence, and the evidence continues to accumulate in directions that none of us anticipated. Every new measurement answers one question while quietly asking 2 more. End of recording 002. Forecast for tomorrow, and for every tomorrow visible on the models, rain. Good evening, this is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 1853 Newfoundland Standard Time, recording number 003. Duration of the continuous precipitation event, 3 years, 230 days. Verified interruptions in measurable rainfall at this station, 0. Total recorded accumulation now exceeds 52,000 millimeters. Atmospheric pressure this evening is 996.8 hectopascals. Wind east-northeast at 14 kilometers per hour. Relative humidity remains effectively 100%, although that measurement has become almost ceremonial. Recording humidity during the past 3 years has been rather like recording that the Atlantic Ocean remains wet. I spent most of today recalibrating instruments that no longer fail because of mechanical fatigue, but because they were never designed to exist in perpetual saturation. Every seal eventually swells. Every lubricant eventually emulsifies. Every electrical connector develops an opinion about corrosion. Manufacturers used to publish maintenance schedules in months or years. We now calculate them in accumulated millimeters of rainfall. There is an engineer in Germany whom I've never met who has become one of my closest colleagues, simply because he continues redesigning precipitation gauges for conditions no one believed would ever exist. His latest email concluded with the sentence, "I no longer believe we manufacture weather instruments. I believe we manufacture temporary agreements with water." I found that surprisingly poetic for someone whose previous correspondence mostly involved gasket specifications. The World Meteorological Organization officially retired the phrase prolonged rainfall event 6 months ago. Internal communications now use the term persistent global hydrological state. Scientists adore long names because they postpone admitting ignorance. A complicated label creates the comforting illusion that a phenomenon has been understood merely because it has been categorized. It has not. We have simply run out of shorter ways to describe it. International weather maps have become strangely monotonous. There was a time when forecasting involved tracking fronts sweeping across continents, watching cyclones deepen, monitoring high-pressure ridges, anticipating cold outbreaks. The atmosphere possessed personality then. It argued with itself. Now every satellite composite resembles yesterday's image, with only minor rearrangements of texture. Clouds drift, rain intensity varies, winds shift, yet the larger pattern refuses to evolve. It is less like weather than climate frozen in motion. Imagine listening to a symphony that resolves into a single sustained note, yet somehow continues to produce endless variations within that one note. That is what our atmosphere has become. The station received its quarterly supply shipment last week, although shipment no longer means what it once did. The highway into the peninsula disappeared during the second year beneath successive landslides and has since been abandoned. Supplies now arrive aboard tracked amphibious vehicles designed originally for Arctic expeditions. Their drivers spend more time consulting geological surveys than road maps. Bridges are considered temporary structures throughout eastern Canada now. Rivers have become impatient. They no longer accept the channels assigned to them by previous centuries. Cartographers are quietly becoming more valuable than highway engineers. I spoke with my sister in Saskatoon yesterday. We used to compare weather out of professional habit. It had become our little joke over the years. She would tease me about Atlantic storms while I mocked prairie winters. Yesterday she paused after asking how much rain had fallen here this month and then laughed softly before saying, "I don't even know why I asked. It's raining here too." There was something profoundly unsettling about that exchange. Not because of the rain itself, but because neither of us could remember the last time either of us had begun a conversation by mentioning sunshine. We had unconsciously edited an entire category of human experience out of our language. The biological reports arriving from research stations around the world have become increasingly fascinating. Freshwater fish are expanding into territories that were formerly too seasonal to support them. Amphibian populations have exploded in some regions while collapsing in others due to fungal diseases accelerated by permanent moisture. Insects once limited by dry summers are migrating thousands of kilometers beyond their historical ranges. Forest ecologists report that mature trees are dying less from drought or fire than from simple exhaustion. Roots require oxygen as much as water. After 3 uninterrupted years, entire hillsides have become slow-moving sponges, where the ground itself seems uncertain whether it still wishes to be land. There are moments, usually around dusk, when the station feels less like an observatory and more like a lighthouse built on the edge of an ocean that has forgotten where it ends. The rain has a remarkable ability to erase scale. Mountains vanish behind translucent curtains. The horizon retreats until the world appears only a few hundred meters wide. Occasionally I stand outside beneath the instrument mast, listening to millions of droplets striking metal, rock, moss, ocean, rooftop, and my own jacket simultaneously. No individual drop can be heard. Only the collective sound exists now, a vast, featureless whisper that has become the permanent background of the planet. I have listened to recordings from before the event, archived merely 5 years ago. I was startled by how noisy the old world was. Wind through dry grass, insects, the crackle of leaves, the distant rumble of tires on pavement. Today the rain wraps itself around every sound, until the entire earth seems to be speaking in lowered voices. The astronomical observatories have begun publishing an unusual statistic alongside their research papers: consecutive days without direct optical observation. Some facilities have not seen the night sky in nearly 1,000 days. Radio astronomy continues without difficulty, of course, but the great optical telescopes now spend much of their existence waiting behind closed domes, their mirrors polished for stars they cannot reach. One astronomer remarked during a conference call that humanity has accidentally become a subterranean civilization without ever moving underground. I understood exactly what he meant. We still inhabit the surface, yet we experience the heavens only indirectly, through instruments and memory. I remain committed to the scientific method. That deserves repeating, perhaps more for myself than for any future listener. Every hypothesis must remain subordinate to observation. Every conclusion must earn its place. But I confess that I have begun carrying an old photograph inside my field notebook. It was taken here at this station almost 20 years ago. There is nothing remarkable about it, just the observation tower under an impossibly blue Newfoundland sky, white cumulus clouds drifting lazily over the Atlantic, sharp shadows stretching across dry gravel. I look at it from time to time, not out of nostalgia, but calibration. Instruments require reference standards. Perhaps memory does as well. End of recording 003. Forecast, steady rain, occasionally lighter, occasionally heavier, with no indication that either description carries any meaningful distinction anymore. Good evening. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 2011 Newfoundland Standard Time, recording number 004. Duration of the persistent global hydrological state, 4 years, 10 months, and 19 days. Verified interruptions in measurable precipitation at this station, 0. Total rainfall accumulation has now exceeded 87,000 millimeters. Mean annual precipitation across much of eastern North America is no longer considered a meaningful statistic. The phrase annual average quietly disappeared from several international climatological reports last month. It has become increasingly difficult to average something that has effectively ceased to possess seasons. One of the stranger developments over the past year has not involved the atmosphere at all. It has involved language. The Canadian Meteorological Service officially retired several forecast terms after determining that they no longer communicated useful information to emergency planners. Chance of showers vanished first, followed by clearing skies, dry conditions, and eventually fair weather. Even storm has become strangely obsolete. Storms imply contrast. They imply a beginning and an end. The atmosphere still produces stronger winds, heavier precipitation, and deeper pressure systems, but these are now described simply as intensifications. The old vocabulary belonged to a planet where weather moved on. Ours no longer does. The global observing network has contracted considerably. We continue receiving data from approximately 63% of the stations that were active when the rain began. Some have failed from corrosion, others were abandoned after repeated flooding. Entire national meteorological agencies now operate from fewer facilities, concentrating resources on maintaining only their most robust observatories. There is a curious irony in all this. We possess more climate data than any civilization in history, yet our understanding advances more slowly each year. It is rather like reading the same page of an enormous book over and over, convinced that eventually one additional sentence will reveal why the rest of the chapters refuse to turn. Yesterday I performed what used to be the station's winter snow survey. I still complete it every year, partly out of habit and partly because scientific records should document absence as faithfully as presence. The clipboard still bears the printed title, Seasonal Snowpack Assessment. I walked the traditional route through dripping spruce, across streams that have forgotten they were once frozen, and up the rocky ridge overlooking the Atlantic. Snow depth, 0 centimeters. Ice thickness, not measurable. Frost penetration, negligible. The survey took 11 minutes instead of 4 hours. I filed it anyway. The ocean has changed color, not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but after 35 years studying this coastline, I can no longer deny it. The Atlantic outside this station has acquired a muted green-gray quality that persists regardless of lighting conditions. Satellite ocean color instruments confirm subtle but widespread changes in phytoplankton populations throughout the North Atlantic. Reduced sunlight has altered marine productivity in ways that fisheries scientists are only beginning to quantify. Entire food webs appear to be reorganizing themselves beneath the surface, while the rain quietly occupies everyone's attention above it. Humanity has always been rather poor at noticing simultaneous disasters. The psychological studies being circulated among research institutions make fascinating reading. Apparently, humans estimate the passage of time partly by remembering changes in weather. Sunny weekends, snowstorms, autumn leaves, heat waves. These become mental landmarks separating one memory from another. Remove those landmarks, and people begin reporting that entire years feel compressed together. I experienced exactly that last week. I found an old maintenance log and was absolutely certain I had replaced the western rain gauge mast only 18 months ago. It was 3 years ago. I checked twice because I thought someone had misprinted the date. They hadn't. The rain has become so consistent that memory itself struggles to measure duration. The station remains supplied, although increasingly by sea. Roads throughout Newfoundland now exist in fragments connected by ferries, temporary causeways, and engineering optimism. Every month brings another announcement that rebuilding some highway is no longer economically practical. Civil engineers have quietly shifted from designing permanent infrastructure to designing structures expected to fail gracefully. I never imagined hearing phrases like planned bridge lifespan, 8 months discussed without irony. Communication with colleagues has changed as well. We still exchange atmospheric measurements, ocean salinity profiles, cloud top temperatures, and aerosol concentrations, but increasingly our conversations drift toward maintenance. Which synthetic lubricants survive longest under constant moisture? Which solar panels continue producing reasonable output beneath uninterrupted cloud cover? Which fungi have begun colonizing instrument housings? There is something profoundly human about scientists faced with the collapse of planetary weather patterns spending 20 minutes discussing waterproof cable connectors. Perhaps civilization survives one gasket at a time. 3 weeks ago, something happened that I have replayed repeatedly in my mind. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. The overcast above the station became thinner, not broken, not open, simply thinner. I noticed it because the quality of light inside my office changed. Shadows did not appear, but objects became slightly more defined, as though someone had increased the contrast of the entire world by a few percent. Every instinct I possessed sent me outside before I had consciously decided to move. I stood on the observation platform in steady drizzle, looking upward with an excitement I am almost embarrassed to admit. The cloud deck brightened until I became convinced that somewhere above it the sun must be visible for the first time in years. I remember smiling. Then the brightness slowly faded. The clouds thickened once more. Nothing had actually changed. Later that evening I examined the satellite imagery. A temporary reduction in cloud optical depth had passed over eastern Newfoundland. No breaks, no direct solar radiation, merely a slightly thinner blanket. Yet for those 4 seconds I experienced something astonishing. Hope, it seems, requires remarkably little energy. I have begun wondering whether future climatologists, if such people exist, will regard these recordings as scientific documents or historical artifacts. Perhaps both. The distinction is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Every precipitation measurement now also measures civilization. Every river discharge estimate quietly describes another flooded town. Every cloud analysis carries unspoken implications for agriculture, transportation, economics, and memory. The atmosphere has become the dominant institution on Earth. Governments still meet, markets still fluctuate, elections still occur in some countries, but all of them now operate beneath the same uninterrupted conversation between ocean and sky, a conversation that has not paused long enough for humanity to finish a single sentence. End of recording 004. Forecast, continuous precipitation. Confidence unusually high. I have become uncomfortable assigning 100% certainty to anything in science, but I am beginning to suspect the atmosphere has become similarly uncomfortable with assigning anything else. Good evening, this is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 22:03 Newfoundland Daylight Time, recording number 005. Duration of the persistent global hydrological state, 7 years, 182 days. Verified interruptions in measurable precipitation at this station, 0. Total accumulated rainfall now exceeds 128,000 millimeters. Mean cloud cover over the North Atlantic during the previous 12 months, 99.8%. Direct solar radiation measured at this station since the event began, statistically insignificant. I still calibrate the pyranometer every month. It continues to perform flawlessly while observing almost nothing. I received what may be the final printed scientific journal this morning. Not the final issue of a particular publication. The final printed journal, full stop. The package arrived sealed inside 3 layers of waterproof polymer wrapping that probably cost more than the publication itself. The cover was slightly warped despite every precaution. Moisture, it seems, has become an editor. The accompanying letter explained that international paper production has fallen below sustainable levels, not because forests have disappeared, but because drying paper in industrial quantities has become prohibitively expensive. Continuous atmospheric moisture has transformed something as ordinary as manufacturing clean sheets of cellulose into an engineering challenge. Beginning next month, every remaining scientific publication will exist only as compressed digital archives transmitted over whatever communications infrastructure still functions. I held that journal for several minutes before opening it. Scientists spend their lives believing that information matters more than the medium carrying it. Usually that's true, but there was something quietly unsettling about realizing I might never again hear the sound of crisp pages turning beneath dry fingertips. I found myself running my thumb along the edge of the paper simply because I could. The pages still possessed that faint stiffness unique to books that have never absorbed moisture. I had forgotten such paper existed. The irony, of course, is that the journal itself contained 3 papers describing accelerated fungal degradation in archival libraries. One of the first casualties of the rain, it turns out, has been history. The atmospheric chemistry continues to refuse every explanation we propose. Global evaporation rates remain mathematically inconsistent with observed ocean surface temperatures. We have now measured this discrepancy independently from satellites, weather balloons, ocean buoys, aircraft, and coastal stations. All the instruments agree, all the equations agree. Yet together, they describe an atmosphere that should have exhausted its available water years ago. Somewhere, energy is entering the hydrological cycle without revealing where it originates. Every known mechanism falls short by approximately 6%. 6%. Before the rain began, I would have dismissed a 6% discrepancy as a calibration problem. Today, 6% appears capable of reorganizing civilization. One of my colleagues in Japan jokingly referred to it as the missing ocean. No one laughed. The station is quieter now than I ever imagined possible. There used to be maintenance crews rotating through every few weeks. Graduate students arrived each summer carrying notebooks and optimism. Visiting researchers argued cheerfully over cloud classifications while someone inevitably complained about Newfoundland black flies. The cafeteria coffee machine broke every second Tuesday, or so it seemed. Now there is only me. The station officially became an autonomous observation facility 18 months ago. Budget reductions, transportation difficulties, and population relocations made permanent staffing impossible. Every 6 months, an amphibious supply convoy arrives with diesel filters, preserved food, replacement sensors, batteries, medical supplies, and, somewhat optimistically, fresh vegetables. The convoy stays for less than an hour. Nobody lingers anymore. Travel has become an exercise in exposure rather than distance. Several nations formally abandoned maintaining secondary highways this spring. The photographs are extraordinary in a deeply depressing sort of way. Asphalt roads now resemble forgotten canals. Guardrails disappear beneath sheets of moss. Concrete bridges wear hanging gardens of ferns where decorative flowers once stood. Nature has not reclaimed civilization violently. It has simply remained wetter than civilization could tolerate. Last week I walked to the abandoned lighthouse 2 kilometers south of the station. It used to overlook cliffs extending nearly 30 meters above sea level. The cliffs are gone, not entirely, of course, they simply retreated. 7 years of uninterrupted saturation has transformed coastal erosion from a geological process into an annual maintenance issue. Entire sections of shoreline detach with almost no warning. Layers of shale that survived millions of years of ordinary weather have surrendered in less than a decade. Standing there, I realize that my own maps have become historical documents. The coastline printed on them no longer exists. Marine biologists have begun reporting something equally peculiar beneath the surface. Kelp forests throughout the North Atlantic are collapsing despite abundant water and relatively stable temperatures. Reduced sunlight has lowered photosynthesis just enough to alter entire ecosystems. Fish populations increasingly follow unfamiliar migration routes because the underwater forests that once sheltered them have thinned into scattered patches. One researcher remarked during a conference that the oceans now resemble forests permanently trapped beneath overcast skies. I understood exactly what she meant. The atmosphere has stolen sunlight from places it never physically reaches. I occasionally reread the earliest recordings before making a new one. Recording one still surprises me. The man speaking sounds remarkably confident. He believed the atmosphere merely owed him an explanation. He believed enough observations would eventually corner the truth. He believed every anomaly represented ignorance waiting patiently to become knowledge. I don't think he was naive. I think he lived on a different planet, not physically, philosophically. There was an assumption shared by every scientist before the rain that the natural world, while unimaginably complex, was fundamentally cooperative. If we measured carefully enough, if we built better instruments, if we waited long enough, nature would eventually reveal its mechanisms. I still believe that. Mostly, but increasingly I wonder whether the atmosphere has entered a state that no human civilization was ever destined to witness, not because it is impossible, but because civilizations usually don't survive long enough to study it. That is a profoundly different question. This afternoon, just after 1700 hours, I heard something that caused me to stop writing almost immediately. It took several seconds before I recognized what it was. There was no rain. Not because it had stopped, because something had become louder. A raven. One solitary raven had landed on the communications mast above the station. Its call echoed across the soaked cliffs with startling clarity. For those few moments, the bird's voice rose above the endless rainfall. I realized then that I could not remember the last time I had heard a bird sing, not because birds had vanished, because the rain had become the soundtrack against which every other sound was forced to compete. The raven called 3 times, and then it flew east into the gray Atlantic. The rain immediately reclaimed the silence. I listened for another hour. Nothing. End of recording 005. Forecast rain. The forecast software now automatically fills that field before I begin typing. I still verify it manually. Old habits deserve the dignity of surviving a little longer than the world that created them. Good evening. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 1941 Newfoundland Standard Time, recording number 006. Duration of the persistent global hydrological state, 8 years, 9 months, and 12 days. Verified interruptions in measurable precipitation at this station, 0. Total accumulated rainfall now exceeds 164,000 millimeters. Mean cloud base altitude during the previous 90 days, 312 meters. Visibility this evening, 1.6 kilometers over the Atlantic. Air temperature, 4.3 degrees Celsius. Sea surface temperature, 5.1. Barometric pressure remains remarkably ordinary. That continues to be one of the greatest mysteries. Nothing about the individual measurements appears extraordinary. It is only when assembled together that they become impossible. I have officially stopped issuing monthly forecasts. Not because forecasting has become difficult, because it has become dishonest. For the past 3 years, every forecast I have written has differed only in wording. Persistent precipitation expected. No significant change anticipated. Cloud cover remaining continuous. It occurred to me that I was performing a ritual rather than communicating information. Forecasts exist to reduce uncertainty. We no longer possess enough uncertainty to justify the exercise. The atmosphere has become less a sequence of events than a permanent condition. The station received an archival directive from Ottawa last month. It was transmitted through 4 redundant communication networks and accompanied by an unusual priority code I had never encountered before. The instructions were simple. Preserve observational continuity above all else. If staffing becomes impossible, automate. If automation fails, simplify observations. If power becomes limited, record only precipitation, pressure, temperature, and time. If digital storage fails, write measurements by hand. If communications cease, continue recording locally. That final instruction occupied my thoughts for several days. Continue recording locally. It assumes there may come a day when no one is listening. It also assumes that the recording itself still matters. Perhaps those assumptions are the same thing. I've begun noticing the station aging in ways that buildings ordinarily conceal. The reinforced concrete foundation has developed hairline fractures, where decades of freeze-thaw cycles were expected to occur. Instead, the engineers unintentionally designed it for a climate that no longer exists. Water now seeps into microscopic imperfections every hour of every day. Expansion joints remain permanently swollen. Steel handrails require replacement not every 20 years, but every 18 months. Paint has become a temporary color rather than a protective coating. There is a sentence carved into a brass plaque near the main entrance. It commemorates the station's opening in 1974. Dedicated to understanding tomorrow's weather. I walked past it yesterday and realized that tomorrow's weather has finally become yesterday's weather. The plaque has not yet noticed. The marine reports arriving from the North Atlantic have become increasingly sparse. Commercial shipping continues, though on a vastly reduced scale. Insurance costs alone have rendered many routes economically impossible. Ports throughout eastern Canada now employ full-time dredging fleets simply to remove sediment delivered by rivers that have spent nearly a decade carrying mountains toward the sea grain by grain. One hydrographer calculated that several Newfoundland harbors have accumulated more sediment in 9 years than they previously did in 70. Land, it appears, is dissolving faster than history anticipated. The forests surrounding the station have changed again. At first, constant rain encouraged explosive growth. Moss climbed every trunk. Ferns spread into places previously too dry to support them. The landscape became astonishingly green. Then the green began changing. Spruce needles dulled, birch bark darkened. Entire stands of balsam fir developed fungal bloom so extensive they appeared dusted with pale ash. Fallen logs no longer decay over years. They soften within months, collapsing beneath their own weight until the forest floor resembles a saturated sponge layered atop older generations of saturated sponge. Ecologists recently proposed abandoning the phrase old-growth forest in favor of something rather unsettling, continuous decomposition ecosystem. I understand the science. I dislike the phrase. Humanity has always preferred nouns that imply stability. The earth seems to be replacing them with verbs. There is another development I feel obligated to document, although it falls outside climatology. People have begun forgetting colors, not literally, not biologically, culturally. A psychologist from Copenhagen distributed a fascinating survey involving children's drawings collected over the past decade. The youngest children, those born after the rain began, consistently depict the sky as pale gray. Perfectly accurately from their perspective. When asked to color the sun, many simply leave the circle white because they have almost never observed it directly. One particularly revealing study asked children to choose the correct color for distant mountains. Most selected muted charcoal instead of blue because atmospheric haze and continuous rainfall have removed the optical effect that once made distant landscapes appear vividly azure. Imagine that. An entire generation learning the wrong color of distance. No catastrophe announces itself with greater politeness than that. I found an old box while cleaning the storage room last week. Inside were hundreds of photographic slides from the station's earliest years, reel film, cardboard mounts, tiny transparent windows into another atmosphere. I held one against my desk lamp. The image showed the observation tower on an autumn afternoon. Blue, not merely blue, impossible blue. The sort of blue one would assume had been exaggerated by an enthusiastic artist. I stared at it for several minutes before recognizing something even stranger. Shadows. Sharp, dark, well-defined shadows stretching across dry gravel. For a moment they looked unnatural, not because the photograph was unusual, because I had unconsciously forgotten how decisively sunlight divides light from darkness. The rain has blurred that distinction from the world itself. Even night has become softer. Even noon hesitates. I replaced the slide in its sleeve and returned it to the box. Then I looked out my office window. The station lights reflected from a million descending droplets. Beyond them lay the Atlantic, invisible except where the beam from the old lighthouse dissolved into the rain after perhaps 200 meters. Sometimes I wonder whether I still work at the edge of an ocean or merely beside an endless curtain. The instruments insist the ocean remains exactly where it has always been. My eyes increasingly disagree. One final observation before concluding tonight's recording. The rain has developed textures, not different intensities, different personalities, and there are days when it falls with remarkable precision, every droplet seeming evenly spaced, almost engineered. Other days it drifts sideways in delicate sheets so fine they resemble breath on cold glass. Occasionally it produces a faint whisper unlike ordinary rainfall. a sound that several acoustic engineers have independently confirmed, but none can yet explain. They believe it arises from interference patterns created by billions of droplets interacting within exceptionally stable atmospheric layers. I believe them. Still, every so often I catch myself listening to it as though the atmosphere is trying very hard to remember how to speak. End of recording 006. Forecast. Rain. I have deleted every other forecast template from the station computers. They were occupying storage space that reality no longer requires. Good evening. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 21:28 Newfoundland Daylight Time. Recording number 007. Duration of the persistent global hydrological state, 11 years, 5 months, and 24 days. Verified interruptions in measurable precipitation at this station, 0. Total accumulated rainfall now exceeds 203,000 millimeters. Average atmospheric transmissivity to visible sunlight has declined another 3.8% since recording 6. That figure has now been independently verified by observatories in South America, Southern Africa, Australia, and Iceland. The atmosphere is becoming marginally less transparent with each passing year, not enough for anyone standing outside to notice from one season to the next. More than enough for every instrument ever designed to measure light. I have received the last satellite image, not the latest one, the last one, at least I believe it is. The polar orbiting weather satellites have been disappearing gradually over the past 4 years. Fuel depletion, failed electronics, missed orbital corrections. Normally new launches would quietly replace them. They always had before. But launches became increasingly infrequent as international priorities shifted. Rocket manufacturing depends upon industrial supply chains. Industrial supply chains depend upon transportation. Transportation depends upon infrastructure. Infrastructure depends upon weather remaining merely inconvenient instead of permanent. No one component failed. They simply became too expensive to keep rescuing. The final composite image arrived yesterday from the European Meteorological Center before transmission ended without explanation. I printed it immediately. It now hangs beside my desk. From orbit, the Earth appears almost featureless. The continents remain visible only as faint variations beneath an immense, uninterrupted blanket of white and gray stretching across nearly every ocean and every inhabited landmass. Tropical convection still pulses. Polar systems still rotate. Hurricanes still attempt to organize themselves before dissolving into the larger circulation. The machinery of meteorology continues operating faithfully beneath a cloud structure that has become larger than weather itself. For most of my career, satellite images told stories. Now they tell persistence. The station clock stopped 3 weeks ago, not the electrical system, the mechanical wall clock in the operations room. Water had finally entered the movement despite repeated maintenance. I considered repairing it. Instead, I left it exactly where it stopped. 14 minutes past 3. Visitors would probably assume it commemorates some dramatic moment. It doesn't. It merely surrendered. There seems to be an honesty in that. The digital clocks continue functioning. The old one simply reminds me that every machine eventually negotiates separately with time. One subject has quietly disappeared from scientific conferences. Climate change, not because it became irrelevant, but because it became impossible to isolate. There was a period during the 3rd and 4th years when nearly every discussion began by asking whether the persistent global hydrological state represented an extreme consequence of anthropogenic warming. Entire research institutes devoted themselves to answering that question. The consensus today is strangely unsatisfying. Climate change almost certainly influenced how the atmosphere responded. It almost certainly did not create whatever the atmosphere has become. Imagine striking a piano key with greater force than intended. You might produce a louder note, you would not produce an entirely different instrument. Somewhere, somehow, the Earth has become a different instrument. No one has yet explained how. The biological observations continue to astonish me. The migratory birds have largely abandoned Newfoundland, not because they have nowhere to go, because there is no longer a meaningful season telling them when to leave. Migration evolved around predictable changes in temperature, daylight, and food availability. The daylight still changes. Everything else has blurred. Several tagged seabirds have now remained within the North Atlantic year-round, despite instincts refined across thousands of generations. Evolution, it appears, requires remarkably little time to become confused. Yesterday I climbed onto the roof to inspect the precipitation collectors. I try to make that climb every month, regardless of weather. An old superstition, perhaps. The station deserves to know someone still walks upon it. While tightening one of the mounting brackets, I became aware of something so unfamiliar that I nearly lost my balance. My own footsteps. I could hear them, not because the rain had stopped, because the roof had momentarily become louder. The water flowing through the drainage channels had shifted into a harmonic frequency that briefly canceled part of the rainfall around me. For perhaps 10 seconds I heard rubber boots striking metal roofing with astonishing clarity. Then the resonance changed. The rain reclaimed every sound. It occurred to me that I had not heard myself walking outdoors in years. There are losses too subtle for history books. The world's shadows disappear. The smell of dry paper vanishes. Children forget the color blue. A man climbs onto his own roof and briefly rediscovers the sound of his footsteps. None of those events will appear in any official chronology. Yet collectively, they describe civilization just as accurately as the collapse of highways or harvests. This afternoon, I opened the emergency archive vault beneath the station. Every weather station has one, or had one, fireproof and waterproof and shock-resistant, designed to preserve irreplaceable climate records. The shelves were almost empty, not because records had been removed, because nearly everything is digital now. There were a few magnetic tapes, some handwritten logbooks from the late 1970s, a stack of aerial photographs, an old mercury thermometer retired decades ago. I stood there longer than necessary. The vault suddenly felt less like an archive and more like a museum assembled before anyone realized history had ended. I selected one of the handwritten logbooks at random. July 18th, 1983. The observer's comments read, "Warm afternoon, excellent visibility, pleasant breeze from the southwest, maintenance completed under clear skies." Nothing more. No dramatic scientific discovery and no historic event, just a scientist making an ordinary note about an ordinary day. I read that single sentence 5 times. It may be the rarest description remaining on Earth. Tonight, as I finish this recording, the station windows tremble softly beneath another endless curtain of rain. Somewhere beyond the darkness lies the Atlantic Ocean, though I have not actually seen its horizon in almost 6 years. I know it remains there because the tide gauges continue rising and falling with impeccable precision. The moon still exerts its ancient influence. Gravity continues to perform its duties without complaint. The universe itself appears entirely unconcerned with our atmospheric predicament. I find that oddly comforting. Stars still exist. Blue skies almost certainly still exist. The sun continues shining with exactly the same luminosity as it did before the rain began. It is simply carrying on above a layer of cloud that humanity has not crossed in over a decade. Sometimes I imagine airline passengers still flying there, looking down upon an endless white ocean of cloud while sunlight pours across the wings. Then I remember there are no airline passengers anymore. Only the cloud remains. End of recording 007, forecast rain, duration unknown, confidence no longer expressed as a percentage, only as experience. Good evening. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 2057 Newfoundland Daylight Time. Recording number 008. Duration of the persistent global hydrological state, 13 years, 1 month, and 16 days. Verified interruptions in measurable precipitation at this station, 0. Total accumulated rainfall has now surpassed 246,000 millimeters. Ocean salinity in the western North Atlantic has fallen another 0.8 practical salinity units since my previous recording. That number sounds insignificant until one remembers that oceans normally resist change with astonishing stubbornness. To alter an ocean by even a fraction requires rivers carrying continents into the sea. The station became an island today, not geographically, administratively. At 9:14 this morning, the final terrestrial communications line went silent. There was no dramatic farewell, no emergency broadcast, no frantic voices. The signal simply accumulated more transmission errors until the software quietly displayed a message I had never expected to read. Remote network unavailable. The system attempted to reconnect every 30 seconds for 6 hours before finally asking whether I wished to continue operating in autonomous mode. I selected yes. The computer thanked me. That felt strangely inappropriate. As far as I know, the satellite uplink failed sometime last winter. I have continued transmitting these recordings on schedule because transmission is part of the observation protocol, not because I possess evidence that anyone still receives them. The antenna still rotates. The transmitters still warm the equipment room with their familiar hum. Somewhere above the clouds, if any communication satellites remain functional, my recordings continue climbing into the rain. Whether they ever descend again, I cannot say. One adapts to isolation more quickly than one expects. Loneliness is another matter. The scientific routine remains remarkably intact. I rise at 600, instrument inspection at 700, balloon launch at 900 when helium supplies permit. Ocean sampling every Thursday, equipment maintenance every second Saturday, recording every 6 months. The routine is not merely efficient, it is structural. Civilizations, I've concluded, are really collections of routines performed simultaneously by millions of strangers. When enough routines disappear, civilization appears to collapse all at once. It doesn't. It simply stops remembering what time it is. I have begun naming the storms, not officially, privately. Meteorologists are discouraged from becoming emotionally attached to weather systems. Detached observation improves scientific judgment. Ordinarily, I agree. But after 13 years, the distinctions between one intensification and another have become subtle enough that names help organize memory. There was Margaret, whose easterly winds stripped the station's western siding. Hector, which carried enough Atlantic spray inland to kill every surviving patch of wildflowers around the lighthouse. Benjamin, memorable only because it remained almost perfectly stationary for 23 days. And Eleanor. Remember Eleanor because during one evening its rainfall became so astonishingly uniform that the entire landscape disappeared into what looked less like weather than frosted glass. It was beautiful. I hesitate to admit that. Scientists are expected to appreciate phenomena without assigning them aesthetics. I have failed in that regard. The rain is terrible. It is also magnificent. Those two observations are not contradictory. The biological reports ceased arriving months ago, but I continue making my own. The forest behind the station now resembles something from the Carboniferous period. Ferns reach my shoulders. Moss blankets everything that remains still for more than a week. Tree trunks have become vertical gardens supporting entire ecosystems unrelated to the trees themselves. Several species of mushroom now fruit continuously rather than seasonally. I discovered one growing from the wooden handle of a shovel. The shovel remains perfectly usable. The fungus apparently sees no conflict in sharing it. That thought has occupied me more than perhaps it should. Nature does not distinguish between artifact and habitat. Only humans ever insisted there was a difference. Last Tuesday, I experienced an unexpected equipment failure. The anemometer froze, not from ice, from moss. Tiny spores had gradually colonized the bearing housing until the entire assembly rotated sluggishly beneath a velvet green coating. I removed the instrument and spent 2 hours cleaning it under a work lamp. When I finished, I realized I had not repaired a machine. I had weeded it. The distinction seems increasingly important. The station requires gardening now as much as engineering. I reviewed the atmospheric chemistry archive this week. 13 years of uninterrupted measurements, millions upon millions of observations. One pattern has finally become impossible to ignore. The isotopic composition of the rainwater has been drifting slowly, almost invisibly. Had the event ended after 2 or 3 years, no one would have noticed. After 13 years, the trend is undeniable. The ratio between oxygen-16 and oxygen-18 has shifted beyond every natural fluctuation preserved in ice cores, lake sediments, and historical precipitation records. I recalibrated every spectrometer, repeated every analysis, consulted archive standards. The numbers remained. The water itself is changing, not chemically, not in any way dangerous to drink. Its molecular structure remains ordinary water, yet its isotopic fingerprint increasingly resembles nothing ever previously measured on Earth. I have written and rewritten that sentence a dozen times. It remains scientifically accurate, and I dislike it intensely. For decades, isotope analysis served as one of climatology's most reliable historical tools. Every raindrop carried a tiny memory of where it evaporated, how high it rose, how cold it became before falling. Rain possessed a biography. Now the biographies are becoming unreadable. The water still remembers something. We simply no longer recognize the language. This afternoon, I climbed the observation tower for the first time in nearly 3 months. Maintenance had kept me indoors longer than usual. Standing above the tree line, I found myself staring east across the Atlantic. or rather, toward where I know the Atlantic must be. The horizon has become an act of faith. There are days now when sea, sky, rain, and cloud merge so completely that depth itself disappears. The world becomes a painting executed with only 3 shades of gray. I stood there for nearly an hour, not waiting for the rain to stop. I abandoned that expectation years ago. I was waiting for some small imperfection in the clouds, a brighter patch, a darker line, anything suggesting that somewhere beyond the visible world, the atmosphere still remembered movement. Nothing appeared. The cloud deck stretched outward with such perfect continuity that I experienced the curious sensation of standing not beneath weather, but beneath architecture, as though the planet had acquired a ceiling. It occurred to me then that I no longer think of the rain as something falling. It has become the medium through which everything else exists. Fish live in oceans. Birds once lived in air. Humanity now lives inside rain. End of recording 008. Forecast, continuous precipitation, atmospheric persistence remains absolute. I once believed weather described the state of the sky. Increasingly, I suspect it has become more accurate to say the sky now describes the state of us. Good evening. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 1812 Newfoundland Standard Time. Recording number 009. Duration of the persistent global hydrological state, 15 years, 8 months, and 3 days. Verified interruptions in measurable precipitation at this station, 0. Total accumulated rainfall has now exceeded 291,000 millimeters. Surface atmospheric oxygen remains within expected limits. Carbon dioxide concentrations continue their gradual increase, though more slowly than projected before the event. Mean annual global evaporation, according to the last complete international reconstruction, still exceeds every physically consistent explanation available to us. I continue to repeat that sentence because I fear one day someone may read these recordings and assume we simply stopped looking. We did not. We measured everything we knew how to measure. The atmosphere simply continued answering questions we had never asked. I believe I am now the last continuously staffed weather station on the North Atlantic that is not an official designation. It is merely the conclusion reached after 16 months without hearing another human observer identify themselves over any meteorological frequency. The radios still work. Every morning at precisely 0800 UTC, I transmit station identification, current observations, and an invitation for any active observation post to respond. Every morning I hear static, not silence. Static, there is an important difference. Silence suggests absence. Static suggests distance. Somewhere energy still moves through the atmosphere. Whether anyone remains to shape it into language, I cannot determine. The generators required their first major overhaul since the rain began. Ordinarily, such maintenance would involve 2 technicians over perhaps 8 hours. It required me 6 days, not because the work itself had become more difficult, because I now stop every 20 or 30 minutes simply to document what I observe. The habit has become impossible to separate from living. While replacing a fuel injector, I found myself recording the condensation pattern inside the engine housing. While cleaning the intake filters, I noted the changing color of airborne fungal spores. Even tightening bolts has become another opportunity to measure the world. I used to believe I maintained the station so it could continue observing. Increasingly, I wonder whether I continue observing so that I may justify maintaining the station. Purpose can reverse direction without announcing itself. The rain has altered acoustics in ways I only recently understood. Years ago, I remarked that it softens sound. That was incomplete. It edits sound. The human ear evolved within an atmosphere that alternated constantly between quiet and noise. Birds at dawn, wind through trees, thunder, traffic, footsteps, conversations carried across dry air. Rain removes the edges. Every sound now seems to emerge from the same continuous background, rather than occupying its own space. Music sounds different. I played an old recording of Glenn Gould performing the Goldberg Variations last month. Not because I particularly wanted to hear Bach, because I wanted to know whether I still heard music the same way. I don't. The spaces between the notes have become almost as important as the notes themselves. When the recording ended, the rain simply continued the performance. I sat there for several minutes before realizing I could no longer remember whether the final note had actually stopped. There has been another development, an unexpected one. The clouds have become lower, not dramatically, approximately 48 meters lower on average than they were 3 years ago. That number emerged only after comparing thousands of laser ceilometer measurements. 48 meters is such a tiny change, yet enough that on certain mornings the station itself exists inside the cloud layer. Those are extraordinary days. Rain falls downward through fog, while fog drifts sideways through rain. The distinction between cloud and weather disappears completely. Standing outside, I sometimes extend my hand in front of my face and watch droplets arrive from directions that no textbook ever prepared me to describe. One does not realize how comforting categories are until nature quietly dissolves them. The maintenance logbooks have become unexpectedly philosophical. I found an entry from 2 weeks ago that reads, "Lubricated Western radar pedestal. Replaced 2 corroded fasteners. Reflected briefly upon the lifespan of stainless steel." I genuinely do not remember writing the final sentence. Apparently it seemed entirely reasonable at the time. Perhaps it still does. Everything ages faster now. Metal, concrete, wood, memory. I sometimes wonder whether humans evolved emotionally assuming that the physical world would outlive them. Buildings were permanent. Mountains were ancient. Roads endured generations. Now I watch cliffs retreat measurably from one year to the next. The station itself feels less like architecture than a patient receiving continuous treatment. It survives through maintenance alone. Perhaps civilization always did. We simply mistook maintenance for permanence. 3 days ago, I made the longest walk I've attempted in several years. The old provincial highway still exists in fragments approximately 12 kilometers inland. Or rather, portions of it do. I wanted to verify several abandoned precipitation gauges that had stopped reporting long ago. The forest nearly prevented me from reaching them. Not because of fallen trees, because the vegetation has become astonishingly dense. Moisture has transformed the understory into something almost tropical. Ferns tower above my shoulders. Moss hangs from branches and curtains. Streams appear where maps indicate none should exist. After nearly 4 hours, I located the first gauge. It remained standing. The instrument housing had collapsed. A young birch tree was growing directly through the collection funnel. I stood there longer than necessary. The tree had done nothing remarkable. It simply interpreted the instrument as part of the landscape. That may be the most honest description of civilization I have encountered in years. Nature does not destroy our machines. Eventually, it stops noticing them. As I returned toward the station, dusk settled across the forest, or perhaps afternoon. The distinction remains difficult. The rain continued, as it always has. Then something occurred that I hesitate even now to include in an observational archive. I smelled dust, only for an instant, and a faint, unmistakable scent. Dry mineral soil warming beneath sunlight. The smell disappeared almost immediately. I stopped walking, removed my gloves, knelt beside the saturated ground. Everything remained soaked. There was no explanation, no dry earth, no sunlight, no change in the rainfall. Yet for one impossible second, my memory produced an aroma so vivid that I was transported 20 years into the past. I have since consulted neurological literature preserved in the station archive. Olfactory hallucinations are not uncommon during prolonged isolation. The explanation is entirely satisfactory, scientifically. Emotionally, I remain uncertain. Perhaps the brain, like the atmosphere, eventually begins recycling things it can no longer replace. End of recording 009. Forecast, rain. 15 years ago, that word described a temporary event. Tonight it feels less like a forecast than the name of the world itself. Good evening. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland. Local time is 1903 Newfoundland Daylight Time. Recording number 010. Duration of the persistent global hydrological state, exactly 20 years. Verified interruptions in measurable precipitation at this station, 0. Total accumulated rainfall has now exceeded 387,000 millimeters. Station barometric pressure, 1,004.2 hectopascals. Air temperature, 6.1 degrees Celsius. Relative humidity, 100%. Instrument status, operational. Observer status, operational. Today's recording marks 20 years. When I made the first recording, I was 56 years old. I am 76 now. The station, if one includes its original construction, is now 52 years old. The rain has outlived governments, it has outlived economic systems, it has outlived commercial aviation, it has outlived global shipping as I once understood it. It has outlived the internet, if by internet one means the continuous conversation that once connected billions of people without interruption. Most remarkably of all, it has outlived the expectation that it will end. Hope, I've learned, possesses its own climatology. During the first year, everyone expected next month. By the third year, they expected next spring. By the seventh year, they spoke about recovery plans. By the 12th, they stopped assigning dates. By the 15th, they stopped asking. Sometime during the 19th year, and I cannot identify the precise moment, the possibility that the rain might cease quietly transformed from prediction into mythology. No scientific paper announced that transition. Language simply walked across an invisible line. The station is almost entirely automated now, not because the technology improved, because I have simplified everything that could possibly fail. 3 computers became 2. 2 became 1. Thousands of observations became hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. If necessary, I could continue this station with a mercury thermometer, a barometer, a graduated cylinder, a notebook, and a pencil. That realization comforts me. Science existed long before satellites. It may outlive them as well. 3 months ago, the Western instrument mast finally collapsed. Not dramatically, it leaned, paused, then slowly folded into the moss beneath its own weight. I watched from the operations room. I didn't rush outside, and there was nothing to save. After the rain eased from heavy to merely steady, I walked over and examined the base. The steel had not snapped. It had simply become earth. Corrosion had progressed so completely that flakes of oxidized metal mixed almost seamlessly with the surrounding soil. I found myself wondering where the station ended and Newfoundland began. I no longer believe there is a precise answer. The isotope anomaly continues. I have now accumulated sufficient measurements to state something that 20 years ago would have ended my career. The rain no longer appears to originate entirely from Earth's modern hydrological cycle. I choose those words with extraordinary care. I am not claiming extraterrestrial water. I am not proposing supernatural intervention. I am stating only what the measurements require. The isotopic signature drifting through the atmosphere can no longer be reconstructed from any combination of oceanic evaporation, continental recycling, glacial melt, groundwater exchange, or volcanic emissions known to modern climatology. Every calculation closes imperfectly. Every model leaves behind the same missing fraction. It is as though the atmosphere has spent 20 years borrowing water from an accounting ledger whose opening balance humanity never knew existed. I have resisted saying that aloud until today. 20 years of observations have earned that sentence. Nothing more, nothing less. The biological world has reached a strange equilibrium. The great forests no longer resemble forests of my youth. They resemble cathedrals built from moss. The trunks remain, but every surface has acquired layers of life that once existed only in hidden corners. Ferns grow from branches. Lichens drape telephone poles that no longer carry wires. Roofs support miniature wetlands. Entire ecosystems now flourish upon abandoned vehicles until the vehicles themselves become difficult to distinguish from the hillsides surrounding them. Nature has stopped reclaiming civilization. It has incorporated it. That is a more permanent arrangement. I found one of my old notebooks yesterday. Not an official logbook, a personal notebook from before the rain. Shopping lists, telephone numbers, ideas for lectures, a reminder to buy sunglasses before attending a conference in Arizona. Sunglasses. I stared at that word for several minutes, not because I had forgotten what they were, because I had forgotten that there once existed objects designed specifically to reduce sunlight. What an extraordinary luxury that seems now. There was a period, perhaps around year 8, when I feared prolonged isolation would gradually diminish my memory. The opposite has occurred. The memories have become unnaturally sharp. I can still recall the exact color of the Atlantic on calm September mornings. Not today's Atlantic, the old Atlantic. I remember the peculiar smell of warm granite after an afternoon in direct sunlight. The crackling sound made by dry spruce needles beneath hiking boots. The sensation of squinting. The way distant aircraft occasionally caught the evening sun before disappearing toward Europe. Memory, it seems, does not merely preserve the past, it polishes it. That worries me as a scientist. Memories improve with age. Data does not. That is why these recordings exist. Not to preserve how the rain felt, to preserve what it did. Earlier this afternoon, I climbed the observation tower. I suspect it may have been the last time, not because I am unable, because the stairs have become increasingly unsafe. The bolts holding the upper platform have developed corrosion beyond acceptable engineering limits. I stood there for perhaps 20 minutes. Rain surrounded the station exactly as it had on recording 1. The Atlantic remained invisible. The horizon remained theoretical. The cloud ceiling stretched in every direction without interruption. Then, entirely by chance, I looked downward instead of outward. Tiny rivulets of rainwater ran across the weathered platform, converging into a narrow drain before disappearing through a pipe into the collection system below. Thousands upon thousands of droplets, each following gravity, each behaving exactly as physics demanded, not one of them mysterious. It struck me then that I had spent 2 decades searching for the impossible in the wrong place. The mystery was never inside the raindrops, it was inside their persistence. Every individual observation remained ordinary. Only together did they become unimaginable. Perhaps that has always been true of civilizations as well. No single person builds a country. No single conversation invents a culture. No single raindrop floods a continent. There are moments when enough ordinary things accumulate that they become extraordinary without any one of them ever changing. I believe the rain taught me that. If these recordings survive longer than I do, I hope whoever hears them understands that this station never discovered why the rain began. Science sometimes ends that way, not with answers, with measurements sufficiently careful that someone else may someday ask a better question. The instruments continue recording automatically. Tomorrow they will observe another day of rain, the day after that as well. Whether anyone remains to archive those observations is information beyond the scope of meteorology. It always was. This is Dr. Gilbert Ronaldson, Senior Climate Scientist, North Atlantic Atmospheric Observation Station 4, Cape Blackstone, Newfoundland, recording number 010, 20 years complete. The rain continues and end of recording.